Welcome everyone for taking the time to be here. I'm Sidhu. I lead data and AI for Plaid. And I'm joined with an absolute trailblazer here, is Jennifer Miller, who heads go-to-market for payments and banking at Databricks. As we get started off with this rich topic, which has so much depth to it, I would love for the group to know more about you. So could you introduce yourself and share a little more about yourself?
Yeah, hey everyone. I'm pumped to be here with you all. Thanks to the Plaid team for having us out. I'm Jen Miller. I lead banking and payments go-to-market at Databricks globally. Prior to my time, though, I'm a revenue line leader at a bank. So as a former revenue line leader, I think it's hilarious that I'm doing a talk on governance. Because 5 years ago, I thought governance was the business detractor. And today, I very much view it as the accelerator. So thrilled to be talking with you about this. For those not familiar with Databricks, Databricks is a data and AI company. We really do 4 things for our customers. Number 1, we help our customers unify their data into a single view, which is really critical for AI in the world that we're living in today. That data doesn't necessarily have to be moved into Databricks. We federate data from on-prem, from other sources as well, which is why we're growing so considerably within the banking and payments business. Second, we govern data. We have a product called Unity Catalog, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Unity Catalog provides end-to-end governance for all your data and AI assets, which is really critical. Thirdly, we help customers democratize that data once they've invested in unifying it and governing it, democratizing it so business line users, functional leaders, everyone has access to that data quickly and efficiently to make faster and more agile business decisions. And then thirdly, we help our customers fourthly, we help our customers with agentic AI and workflows on top of that governed and unified data.
It's awesome. Jennifer and I were having a conversation, and I absolutely love Databricks. Truly lucky to be a data practitioner in a world where now Databricks is innovating so much. And I think the topic is super relevant here, as Jennifer's experience both on the banking side and now with Databricks. Because what we are planning to talk about is, especially with AI governance, is not a policy-driven conversation, but more about how it impacts teams, how we execute. So as we get started off here, Jennifer, I'd love to get your perspective on how do you build governance, especially where policymakers are satisfied, at the same time as it helps give clarity to teams to execute easily as well?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and we spend a ton of time with our customers on this strategy, and it's one of the most critical components of any data and AI strategy. At Databricks, we really view governance through a 5-pillar framework. The first is, what is the operating model, and how are you creating an AI or governance-first culture? The second is, how do I satisfy all the regulatory requirements? Every industry has regulators and legal and compliance requirements, so how are you satisfying those? The third is, how do I make sure that the data that I have is being used responsibly and in service of our consumers? The fourth is, what are the technical tools that I'm going to bring in to operationalize my governance framework across my organization? And then the last one is security, and how do I keep the bad guys out? And how do I make sure that the data that I have and the AI that I have and the agents that I have deployed on top of my data is accessing the data appropriately? For us, that comes to life in our product called Unity Catalog, which for us, Unity Catalog is that single pane of glass, that single governance layer, which will govern both your data and all of your AI assets in one view.
That's awesome. And there's like so much richness with all of those dimensionalities and how they interplay with those dimensionalities here. So as we get started off with our conversation, I think the first step which we'll probably kick off is defining a governance strategy here. And let's start at the beginning, right? As we think about this, the way you set up governance is to make sure that you don't treat it as a building inspection, right? Like you actually treat it as a part of your architecture. Because when you do, you can actually get a lot of things right versus actually retrofitting things after the fact, which I think is super critical. So as you're working with customers overall, I would love to get your perspective on starting off with a bird's eye view of what you see with the customers. How are they defining governance strategies across the board? Who owns it? And what's their execution framework overall?
Yeah, I mean, the patterns are pretty clear. Like the companies that are giving governance right, they view it as a product with investments, and they have a roadmap, and they've got clear owners. They have a very disciplined operating model. That operating model is bought in from the top down. They have one catalog that manages the execution of that governance framework, and they measure the governance publicly. So they actually describe how many of my data assets are appropriately cataloged and have a name attached to them. They really view governance, the company's getting it right, view governance as an enabler, not as a detractor of progress. And when you have made that cultural shift, and it's very clear at who across the organization is responsible for each data domain and the governance of that data domain, that's really when the magic happens.
So much richness there. And I think that's one of the things I would say, like, we should absolutely take back as a group here with what Jennifer shared, because even within Plaid's own learning experience, we actually started off with the governance practice by bringing in privacy, security, communications, technology, product, and operations team together at once, because it's not like we wanted to form committees, but at the same time, when you set up these teams for success in terms of building a great framework, then it helps build momentum. It becomes transparent, and I think that's one of the things which what Jennifer shared is absolutely critical. And I want to touch on the next topic, which is basically a little more on the self-serve side. You spoke about Unity Catalog. And Unity Catalog, in my opinion, is an absolute game changer because it actually abstracts a lot of complexity from your customers within the platform. And I don't think anyone has solved governance from a platform perspective the way Databricks is. So could you take me through a lot more of what does good governance look like? And when you take Unity Catalog in terms of the whole framework here, how is it getting applied in terms of execution with your teams too?
Yeah, and the execution process can vary slightly across the organization, but the most critical part is defining a clear operating model for governance. And I think companies that are not doing this well have governance stashed in the back office. They're the folks that no one really wants to talk to, and when they get a Slack or an email, they're like, oh boy. True governance is you have P&L owners, you have line of business executives, you have functional owners that are responsible for the data domain that is supporting their business, and that governance execution lies on their shoulders. There's one human being attached to every domain that is responsible for the governance for that domain. That is when it works the best. I think in terms of getting started, it's number one, defining that operating model and getting top-down buy-in on who that is and names on a piece of paper as to what their roles are. I think number two, it's picking the right catalog, identifying the tool or the tool set that is going to mobilize your governance across your organization. And then third, it's actually codifying your governance within that tool or that catalog. If you have a governance framework that lives in a PDF, you are already losing. The governance needs to be codified in a tool and applied automatically, and that will accelerate deployment across the board. And third, I mentioned this already, but really important to measure publicly how is your governance actually performing, not only from a true governance standpoint, but from a feedback loop standpoint as well. What are you learning and how are you evolving? The last thing I'll say is, I spend a lot of time with customers and they get overwhelmed when they start to think about this cultural shift around governance and how do I actually start wrapping my arms around that and getting my team of people comfortable with what this new world is going to be. And our recommendation is always to start with one domain and one or two use cases within that domain first. If you start there and you build a blueprint and you execute that blueprint, you'll learn a lot by going through that process. And that then becomes, you then have champions and evangelizers across the organization that will help to bring that governance program to life. And then, what we see is companies that take a step back and try to satisfy governance all at once, they're very slow. The winners are picking 1 to 2 use cases and compounding the governance framework from there. It's very difficult, especially at a bank, to rip out governance. And so it's a thoughtful, diligent approach, one use case at a time. And then they compound and 6 months later, you got a whole new governance framework, which has taken hold across your org.
That's amazing. And I think there's a couple of things which you mentioned, which is if you have governance in PDFs, you're already losing. And in fact, if you look at governance across multiple companies, a lot of it is maintained in documents, but not at the platform layer. So you're, in fact, always playing catch up to a large extent, which I think there's a ton of richness there. And as we are continuing on this conversation, I want to move from how you set up governance to putting governance into practice here. What I'd love to understand more is, where do companies who are starting off kick things off right now from a governance standpoint? And what are you seeing both from your experience on the banking side as well as now with Databricks side of what does governance and execution and starting process look like, at least with companies?
Yeah, I think where we see, I'll talk about operating model and where we see the most success with operating model. Typically, defining that is important, and what we see as the fastest path to execution is a federated governance model. So there's a central team of people that define the framework of governance. We talked about the framework, so it's going through the framework and defining how are we going to achieve the governance across each of those pillars. That's managed and defined centrally, and then the execution of that governance framework is federated. And it's generally federated to the domain owners. So, most banks have a head of consumer, domain owner, and that domain owner is a P&L owner. They live within the line of business, and they generally report to the head of consumer or the head of retail banking, and they're responsible for managing that data domain and the governance within that data domain. And their requirement is to make sure that that governance adheres to the framework that is centrally met. What we see as a detractor to pace is when governance is defined and controlled centrally and executed centrally. That ends up being a challenge, because then you end up working, instead of in parallel, you work sequentially, and that slows progress, right? In the world that we're living in, where decisions and things are changing in hours, not weeks, you have to be able to federate that governance framework to make sure that your agents or your people have access to the right information as quickly as they need to drive your business outcomes.
Amazing. And I think there's so much which resonates there. And this is a stat which I learned from Jennifer as well, in terms of the whole governance strategy and executing in a distributed fashion. Teams which did have governance practice were able to execute on 12 times more AI projects as the ones which didn't. Because you, again, go back to retrofitting, which is absolutely spot on there. So I would love to get your thoughts a little more in terms of now, as you talk about governance and especially in practice, how do you think about governance when it comes to scaling? Because we've started building now, and now you have governance practice which is executed and embedded within the organization. I would love to know what kind of inputs would you advocate, especially to centralized standards for this federated execution? And what rules would you especially put centrally, and which ones would you actually federate it to the teams so that you can achieve both from a policy and execution standpoint? And I would love to know why that matters with scaling as well here.
Yeah, I think the key with scaling is having a really crisp framework defined that your domain owners have to execute within. I think the other really important piece with scaling is having a thoughtful feedback loop and making sure that as the business evolves, or as the needs evolve, or as the technology evolves, that there is room for feedback to evolve that governance model. Without that feedback loop, it feels rigid. And what you want to avoid is something needing to evolve because the technology or the business need has evolved, but there's fear in elevating the need to evolve that, because you don't want to not adhere to the governance framework that has been defined centrally. So scaling is certainly a big part of that, is using the federated model to have a high degree of autonomy across the domain owners to execute within the framework, but also create a culture whereby feedback is a part of the equation, so you can evolve and accelerate pace based on what you're learning as you go.
And that really clicks, because when you pair that with both monitoring and execution, I think there is so much velocity which you can gain while not risking integrity, which I think really resonates in terms of how we are applying some of these practices within Plaid too. I do want to dive a little more deep into the monitoring side. To a large extent, you have models and you have scores at the outset from a machine learning perspective, but you also end up having, if the processes are not in place, the outcome looks great, and you have a bunch of things which it looks like a cockpit full of gauges, but you actually don't know where things are moving all the time. I'd love your point of view on like, how do you set up a monitoring loop with an organization, especially when you have a governance practice which is set up here? Like, would love your thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, first, like, the feedback and the monitoring framework can't just be in a dashboard. Like, I see that a lot, where there's a monitoring dashboard where things light up when things aren't working correctly. And if you have a dashboard for your monitoring framework, I think you're losing. We really view, and our recommendation is to have monitoring really across a handful of levels. Like, first is at the data level. Who's monitoring the quality of your data? Who is making sure that your pipelines are working as they're expected? How are you thinking about the data that you need to feed and train your model to get the right outcomes? I happened to be with a large bank yesterday, and I was with their treasurer, and he was telling me that they every large bank has to do a 2052A report, and it's a report that goes daily to the regulators to verify their liquidity positions. And he was telling me that he has a team of 200 people. And that team of 200 people, what they do is they look every single day at the 2052A report and the data that populated the report to make sure it's accurate. Like, that's a failure on governance, right? Your technology and your tool should be signaling if there's an error in your data. So that's one. Two is at the model level. Are you using the right model? And this is a really important part of the monitoring framework. And Databricks, we believe very passionately about this. As part of Unity Catalog and our AI Gateway product, you can measure model performance, do A/B testing. Not every model is the right model for every single use case. So how do you monitor the performance of your model to make sure you're using the right model for the right use case and it's delivering the results that you need? And then lastly, is the model delivering the business outcomes that you need? I think about this a lot as a former revenue line leader in the payments business, and fraud. They were talking about fraud today and approval rates on credit decisioning, and models drift and they change, and the data that feeds them drifts and change. So who's monitoring the performance of that model and making sure that it's delivering the outcomes that the business needs? And I'll just say, if the monitoring framework isn't resulting in change, it's failing. Like, the monitoring should be resulting in evaluation of data. Maybe I need to sunset that model. Maybe I need to change that model, right? If it's not resulting in change, then it's failing. And we very much believe that you need accountable owners that are objective across the monitoring framework to make sure that you're continuing to evolve it in a way that achieves what your desired outcomes are.
So, in essence, what you're telling me is, in fact, like, everything tied to AI governance is pretty much a progression, and it's a learning mechanism and a loop in such a way that you have to pilot, you have to execute, you have to kind of iterate. And as much as like the perspective with AI governance is that it's static, like everything which you're telling me is, think about it as a very progressive approach, and we can actually execute with specific problems, get it right, and then take it on to like more complex problems overall. It's been so amazing having you here and sharing all your wisdom across the board, both at an industry level and a technology level. I would love to get your perspective on if there's something which the team should take away on a Monday morning to be able to reflect on how they should be approaching governance. What would that look like?
Well, I'm going to cheat and give you two. I've always been a little bit of a rule breaker like that. So the first is, I would encourage everyone to go back and find one name to attach to your most important domain. Who is the one human being that is responsible for your most important data domain within your organization? And if you can do that, by Monday, we'll call it Tuesday because Monday's a holiday in the US, you are further ahead than most of your competitors. And being able to do and define who that human being is, it means you're giving them almost P&L level responsibility for that domain. So they are responsible for adherence to the framework. They are responsible for managing the feedback loop and making sure that the feedback loop is sound and that there's action being taken and decisions being made as a part of that feedback loop. Where we see most of our customers stumble is when there are 100 people attached to a data domain in terms of governance. You need one person that is responsible for that. So that would be number one. Number two would be to go back and ask your organization if your catalog covers both your data and your AI assets. And if your catalog, if you have two different catalogs for your data and your AI assets, I think you're failing. And we all, in this world that we're living in, where agents are starting to do more and more on behalf of our companies and on behalf of us as people, it is our responsibility to make sure that those agents are reasoning over the right sets of data. And it's very difficult to do that if you are governing your agents in one catalog, and your models in one catalog, and your data in another. And there were some regulators up here. There are some regulators here today, and I think they would agree with this. It is important in this world that we are operating in and where it's headed that we can provide, as stewards of our companies, that we can provide end-to-end lineage for the actions that our agents and that our AI is taking on behalf of our company. And the only way that you can do that is if you have one single catalog that can give you end-to-end lineage on why did my agent make that decision and what data did it use to make that decision. And that is why one single catalog is really critical. And my call to action would be, if your company is using more than one and you're governing AI in one and data in another, I would implore them to explore that as something that they should look to remediate. Because I think it's adding risk to your organization. I think it's slowing your AI agenda down. And I think your end customers are going to be negatively impacted by that. So those would be my two.
It's amazing. In fact, in essence, what we're learning is integrity, explainability, and speed are not mutually exclusive. They do go together. And Databricks is kind of creating this platform where you can unlock all three of them at the same time with your customers, while not necessarily solving it purely from a platform standpoint and asking your customers to adopt, but you're actually going to the customers and solving the problems for them, which is unbelievable. So thanks a lot for your time. Thanks a lot for your wisdom. And I really appreciate it. And also the crowd really appreciated your time as well. So thanks a lot, Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you.